I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Francisco?
Here.
Hotchkiss?
Here.
House? Murillo?
Here.
Rouse?
Here.
White? Mayor Schneider?
Okay, and I believe we have a ceremonial item.
Proclamation declaring March 12, 2013 as Arbor Day.
Of horticultural heritage and the health and diversity of its urban forest. And whereas the city of Santa Barbara maintains over 40,000 open space park and street trees and recognizes the importance of professional tree care and annual planting programs to sustain a livable community. And whereas Santa Barbara Beautiful contributes to the health of the city's urban forest through support for the street tree planting program. And whereas the city of Santa Barbara and Santa Barbara Beautiful collaborate with local elementary schools to plant trees in observance of Arbor Day. Now, therefore, I, Randy Rouse, Mayor Pro Tem, on behalf of Helene Schneider, by virtue of the authority invested in me as Mayor Pro Tem of the city of Santa Barbara, California, do hereby acknowledge and proclaim March 12, 2013 as Arbor Day in the city of Santa Barbara and recognize the value that trees provide in enhancing the quality of our lives. Thank you very much. And are there two separate items to read? I think these are both the same. Okay, very good. Very good, very good.
Mayor Pro Tem and Council, I want to thank you on behalf of Santa Barbara Beautiful for supporting and in the celebration of Arbor Day. We actually have 4 schools that are involved right now for this project. And last week, we did our very first planting of a coastal live oak tree at Cold Spring School. With the 3rd graders, they were so connected, so excited about the whole project. And Randy Fritz and George Jimenez were both there, and they did a wonderful job in promoting this. We also are donating to all the schools a book that's called Trevor the Traveling Tree, and it's by a local artist, Gail Lucas, who happens to be here today. And the kids are just really excited about that. It's really good to get them involved because they're the generation that's going to continue to plant these trees for us. So, like I like to say, it's a legacy, plant a tree. So, thank you very much. Would you like to say something, Gail?
No, I'm just happy to be a part of this, and I'm glad that Trevor is a part of it, too.
All right, thank you very much.
Hey, thank you.
Okay, are there any changes to the agenda?
No, there aren't. Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
Okay, very good. We'll move to public comment. We have some speaker slips here. If I call your name, please come to the podium. We'll limit it to 2 minutes per speaker. Please keep it to anything that is not currently on our agenda. The first speaker is Tamara Erickson, followed by Kenneth Locke. You have 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem and Council. I'm Tamara Erickson, and I know you're very busy. I just thought I would bring to your attention a couple numbers that may have slipped by you because you're looking at a lot of numbers. I was really surprised to learn that at the last Police and Fire Commission meeting, the police department recommended that nightclub permit number 19 be granted in the entertainment district, and that makes number 6 in the 500 block. as a hotel operator, we are really concerned about the impact of the nightclubs in that area. The fire department has approved capacities of around 4,500 people in just that area. If you look at then that's just for those permitted nightclubs. At the downtown organization this morning, I asked Deputy Chief Mannix what the staffing was for the nightlife enforcement team to check these permits to make sure they're all, compliant. And I was shocked to learn that there's just one officer in charge down there. And so while there are a lot of requirements that the permits, are supposed to comply with, there's absolutely no way that they can be checked. And the impacts to hotels that generate 12% of TOT that stays in Santa Barbara are great. And so we just ask for your help. Ask you to consider, as the next fire and police commissioners come up, there's one that's been on there for 18 years. Look at, ask them those questions and look at the big picture and try to help us as we try to help you. Thanks.
Thank you. Kenneth Locke? Oh, excuse me, Ms. Erickson? Question from Councilmember White?
Actually, for me. Hi.
Oh, okay.
First, anyway, do you think that the sound levels are regularly exceeded in the evenings there? That's what we're talking about, right? Primarily.
Noise and crime, and yes, absolutely. The problem is that one of the requirements is the standard requirement is that the noise doesn't go more than 50 feet from the premises. But there was a permit granted to the bar that's adjacent to ours, about 4 inches from ours, and most of them are within 50 feet. So even if they did comply with that, which they don't, even if there was someone that could make sure they did, wouldn't really make a difference.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. White?
Thank you. Another question, and that is, so how often is your staff calling the police on these issues?
We've given up long ago. We have security officers. They do call if there are fights, when there are dangerous issues, but for noise complaints, we've called often enough and gotten the same reaction often enough that we don't call because it doesn't, it doesn't make
I can
sense.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
If you're feeling like you're not getting an appropriate response, that will become discouraging to call. And at least perhaps we could have this as a little bit of a discussion at our next police chief's report, because what we've heard is that even when an aggrieved party feels like they're not getting a response, just that accumulation of complaints is one of the ways that resources start getting redirected. So and as I say, we'll have a further conversation at the chief comes roughly monthly every 6 weeks to discuss what's happening in the city with us, and there would be an area to talk about it further. But at least I would say I wouldn't be out of line in suggesting that even though it feels futile to continue those complaints coming in, because it does affect the allocation of resources.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good suggestion on the chief's comments. Thank you. Kenneth Locke.
My name is Kenneth Locke. I went before the school board last time they met, and I'll probably go before them this evening. I was working on a page on my Tennaissance, the Renaissance of Tennis page, called The Genius of Tennis. And it turns out, I was just explaining what a genius of tennis is, and to understand what a genius of tennis is, that would be me. You would have to actually understand the genius of tennis in relation to the genius of the philosophy of aesthetics through the fine arts. So if you don't know what a genius is through tennis, most likely you won't know the genius of the philosophy of aesthetics through the fine arts also. And if you don't know the genius of the philosophy of aesthetics, again, it goes back, you won't know what the genius of tennis is either, type of thing. Who I'm claiming to be is actually the first Renaissance genius, the first. So historically, we have not had the recognition of what one is, and as well as the genius of the philosophy of aesthetics through the fine arts, and then the genius of tennis. And it's really important. It turns out that neither, say, the fine arts or athletics have had recognition of what a genius is. And I'm sorry to say that it has affected both of those disciplines severely. And being the genius now, I have to kind of possibly bring people back to where they should have been. But I'm sorry to say that this education that these kids are, and that possibly you've received, it's been corrupted by kind of biblically, the blind will lead the blind. And I'm here to actually bring the full dosage of knowledge in relation to like why we had the abstract art movement of the 20th century and what it means to actually be holistically healthy through athletics. And I'm sorry to say we haven't had a teacher who could provide that, and now I can do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that is it for public comment. We'll move to the consent calendar. If the clerk could please read consent calendar. I understand there's also a need to pull item 7, so we'll need to read that as well.
Okay. Item, Item number 3, municipal code amendments for implementation of the non-residential growth management program. Recommendation that council adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the council of the city of Santa Barbara adding chapter 28.85 to the Santa Barbara Municipal Code, deleting sections 28.87.300 and 28.87.350, and amending sections 28.95.010 through 28.95.070 to implement the city's 2011 General Plan Non-Residential Growth Management Program. Item number 5, records destruction for Parks and Recreation Department. Recommendation that council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the council of the city of Santa Barbara relating to the destruction of records held by the Parks and Recreation Department and the Administration Parks and Recreation Divisions. Item number 6, lease agreement with U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Aviation Administration. Recommendation that council introduce and subsequently adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the council of the city of Santa Barbara approving a 20-year lease agreement with the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Aviation Administration with no monetary consideration for approximately 2.5 acres of land at 10 Edward Burns Place at the Santa Barbara Municipal Airport effective October 1, 2013. And then item number 7, contract for design of wellhead for new corporation yard well.
Thank you. If there are no objections, we'll waive further reading. We're pulling item 7 for discussion.
Thank you,
Ms. Murillo.
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. I would just like to vote no against it. I heard constituent concerns that taking water out of that groundwater area may affect Laguna Creek, what I call Laguna Creek, not Laguna Channel. And so I'm still investigating whether that's so. And so I'd just like to vote no and in an abundance of caution on this item.
Okay, very
So I'm
good.
just asking for it to be voted on separately. And then for item number 2, the minutes, I was out with the flu on February 26th, so that's an abstention from me, please.
All righty. Very good. So we'll go ahead and take item 7 then separately. If there's any further discussion on item 7.
I'd move approval of item 7.
So moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay, thank you.
And then which item is the minutes? Is it 2? I'd move approval of item 2.
I think we can we just abstain on that, or is that a? Okay, well, so we'll go ahead and do that then. Benny, go ahead. Mr. Riley.
Okay. I move approval of item 2.
Second. Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Any abstentions?
Abstain.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I have a question concerning item 8.
Item 8. Very good. Would you please read item 8?
Increase in construction change order authority for the intersection improvement project at Anacapa and Carrillo Streets.
Very good. Mr. Francisco?
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, I've been peppering your staff with questions, and I've gotten answers to most of them, but the one thing I still have a question about, I just realized this, in the budget and financial information section on this in the council agenda report, page 2, bottom of the page, it says that the proposed increase also includes $10,000 for other underground and traffic control extra work items and $10,000 to cover any cost increases. Are those extra work items unrelated to the fiber damage, or is this all part of the same thing?
That's the one question that I was not able to get, I'm not familiar with. However, the engineer who is familiar with it is in the room. and is on the way.
Okay.
He's hiding.
But we have the cost of the change order of the hitting the fiber optic conduit, and then because you never know what can happen next, we have a buffer of $10,000, and then there's the other $10,000. I'd like to introduce Linda Szymanski, Principal Engineer.
Yes, Linda Szymanski, Principal Engineer in the Engineering Division, Mayor Pro Tem and Councilmember Francisco. That $10,000 is outside of the scope of the fiber optics, and then the extra $10,000 that we're asking for is for future potential problems that may come up.
Thank you. And Mr. Kelly, one other question. What changes have been implemented by Public Works to make sure that there are accurate as-built drawings of our city infrastructure?
It's a combination of things. One is to work through that facility to update that facility, which will take some time. In the meantime, remapping, coordinating with the Facilities Division and our own internal mapping. I believe more importantly, though, is that you almost always have to assume that any drawing is incorrect when it's underground and you can't see it. And that's the protocol that we breached. We did not follow that protocol of making sure you check and check again and physically find that utility, either by some superficial evidence of a alignment of manholes, alignment of water valves, or a trench that has been slurried over, or in this particular case, we had the opportunity of following a tracer wire. So there's a combination of things that the perfect storm, so to speak, of why that was missed. And much of it is just our protocol within our own staff, independent of mapping.
And so that protocol has changed?
It's been reinforced. From my perspective, it's always been there. It just was not followed.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, do we need to vote on this separately? Or? Okay, very good. I'll take a motion for the balance of the consent calendar.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? So ordered. Okay, report from that concludes consent calendar. Report from the Finance Committee, Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Finance Committee met today and heard a report on the status of the city's various insurance programs, and we can only assume that staff is doing the right thing.
Okay, very good. We'll move on to our regular agenda from the Finance Department. Would you please read item 13?
Professional services agreements, financial advisory services, and bond counsel and disclosure services.
Okay, very good. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, members of council. Bob Samario, Finance Director, and we're here to talk about professional services agreements. We're recommending that council approve two agreements, or actually authorize staff to execute those agreements, one with a financial advisor and the other with bond and disclosure counsel. We'll be talking about those in a moment. But both of those relate to the issuance of bonds, with some immediate and more long-term, and so we want to talk about that. Just the outline, we'll give you some background, and then why we're proposing the hiring of professionals, a financial advisor, bond counsel, and disclosure counsel, who those consultants are that we're recommending and their fees, and just sort of to edify the council, what's the bond process, what are the mechanics of the steps involved, and how this fits into that context. So background, we anticipate in the near future issuing refinancing certificates of participation for the water fund, and it's to refinance existing debt. And just kind of to step back a little bit, this is not unusual. When interest rates drop lower than, relatively speaking, we always look at, and so do our advisors, assist us in evaluating whether it makes sense for us to refinance existing debt, just like you might with a mortgage, your own home mortgage. If interest rates drop, sometimes you can take advantage of lower interest rates and save on your mortgage, and that's the same with it when it comes to bonds. The bonds that are currently outstanding in the water fund are the 2002 refunding COPs, currently outstanding $10.6 million. So we'll be for sure, at least as assuming council approves this, moving forward with that process. We expect that to close in May. We're also going to be considering the refinancing of two other debts that the water fund has. They relate to the state revolving loans. One was in 2002 with a balance of $12.2 million. We have a second one in 2003 that was taken out. Its current balance of $15.1. A lot of things to consider whether it's going to make sense for us to do that, but we will definitely be evaluating those. The savings, if we were just to do the 2002 refunding COPs, we could reach about $1.6 million in savings over the remaining term of the bonds. It's about $130,000 to $135,000 per year savings, but obviously a lot of money when we're talking about the remaining term, $1.6 million we could save just by refinancing and taking advantage of the lower interest rates. In addition to the water fund COPs that we would be looking to issue, we are also going to consider issuing other COPs for other funds, other enterprise funds. In the wastewater fund, we are potentially going to be funding new capital improvements, so it's not just refinancing existing debt. It's really to bring in new money for infrastructure projects at El Estero, which, of course, as you know, is really aging and needs improvements. And then also in the waterfront fund, they have some existing debt that we'd like to potentially refinance. They have a 2002 refunding COP of about $14 million, and they also have some state loans from the Department of Boating and Waterways totaling $3.1 million. My guess is that those two will be looked at just as we're wrapping up the first one, so hopefully all these will be closed within a 12-month period. So we are proposing that we hire professionals, financial advisors and bonding and disclosure counsels. I think that it's fair to say that at this point, based on the preliminary work we've been doing with those folks, that's highly likely that we would move forward with this pending council approval. That the conditions are right from a market perspective, and as I said, there's a lot of money we could save in doing so, so there's really no reason not to refinance the debt. And we're at a point now where we need to officially and formally hire professionals and retain their services in order to basically to execute these transactions. We couldn't do this in-house, on a practical level. If we were a city of LA who has full-time staff doing these kind of things, perhaps we can have, you can do without professional assistance, but it's pretty unlikely for cities that are, for sure, our size, not to get help from a financial advisor and from bond counsel. And as I said, 3 distinct services that we're going to be looking to, needing. One is for financial advisory services, and the latter 2 will be helped or done by the same firm, Orrick Harrington. So first, talking about the role of the financial advisor, they really are the ones that are kind of the quarterbacks of this process. They assist us through the process. They know what are the required steps, and they really are looking out for our own interests. As you can imagine, it's not, when you take out a mortgage, it's fairly complicated, but selling bonds or certificates of participation, a highly complex transaction and deal. They are the experts. We would not be able to catch little things, and when we're talking about a percentage or half a percentage or even a tenth of a percentage difference, but it's a lot of money involved. So we believe that it makes sense to have a financial advisor. They actually, at times in this case, they would advise us when there's an opportunity. So they called us first just to indicate that you potentially could save some money based on some analysis they've done on a preliminary basis. And so they identified these opportunities to begin with. As I said, they help us through the process. And I guess most importantly, they ensure that we get a good price for the bonds, which is translated into an interest rate. So the key services, recommending a finance structure, whether we, for example, refinance the 2 state revolving loans or not is an important consideration. There are a lot of complexities involved. So they help us to establish what's the appropriate financing structure. And when it comes to going out to the rating agencies, which we're going to have to in order to determine what kind of a credit risk we might be, they are going to be the primary spokespeople for us in that regard. And they also will recommend the timing. Now, the timing is pretty straightforward now because interest rates are historically low. But, for example, when they assisted us with the airport deal, they played a key role in determining when would be the best time to sell those certificates of participation. They also coordinate the competitive sale of the bonds. It's done all online these days through the Internet. And so it is a competitive process. And then they help the bond counsel in actually organizing the closing of the bonds and all the related documents. So the bond counsel, 2 primary roles. One is to give a legal opinion that's delivered with the bonds that they are valid and binding obligations of the issuer. It seems pretty straightforward, but many years ago, this became an issue when the railroads would issue bonds, and because of technicalities, they claimed that they were no longer valid or binding. So since that time frame, a legal opinion has been required with any issue of long-term debt to validate that they are, in fact, legally binding documents. They also give us the legal opinion that the bonds are exempt from federal and state income taxes. That's very important. These are tax-exempt debt that we're issuing. and they give an opinion that makes sure that they are in fact tax exempt. In terms of the role of the Disclosure Council, they prepare a lot of the documents, primarily the official statement, which is the offering document. It's really the prospectus to potential investors. It lists out the purpose of the bonds, the terms of the bonds, and it gives a lot of information about the city and the water fund in particular. They also prepare the official notice of sale. This process can take up to 12 months, depending on the complexity of the transaction. We are about 3 months into this process now, and as I said, we'll be looking to sell bonds by the end of May, so it's probably more like a 6-month process. The Disclosure Council also issues what's called a 10.5-B letter, and this is an important letter because they have to do a lot of due diligence to make sure that the information that investors will be relying upon, that is contained within the offering statement, is not materially misstated. It's a little bit different than what an auditor might do in terms of giving us an opinion. There's a little more assurance with that. This is what they call a limited assurance or a negative assurance letter that says really nothing's come to their attention that would indicate that the information is misstated or omitting any important information or is inaccurate. So, but it's an important part of what they do. So the consultants we're recommending, K&N Public Finance, they're out of Oakland, California. They have assisted the city of Santa Barbara with other COPs or bonds. They most recently assisted us with the airport COPs. Their fees, as I said, we're potentially going to be doing up to 3 deals. For this first one with the water fund, they would charge us $75,000. Just as compares to what they charged us for the airport deal, $115,000. Granted, it was a little more of a complex transaction because the timing became more important, but you can see by comparison that the fees are at least reasonable relative to that. For any subsequent deal that they assist us with, it'd be $60,000. And important to note that the fees that we would pay to the financial advisor are payable from the proceeds, and only if those bonds or COPs are actually sold. So if we get to the point where we finally decide or council decides not going to do it, all the work they have done up to that point will have been done for free. And then when we talk about the savings, I mentioned the $1.6 million in total. That is net of all these costs, whether it be for the financial advisor or for the Bond and Disclosure Council. For Bond and Disclosure Council services, we're recommending Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. Sutcliffe also been involved in a lot of transactions for the city. They're very knowledgeable of the city's finances and operations. Their fees are $85,000 for each transaction. And as was indicated when we talked to the Finance Committee, when we did the airport deal, we did an RFP, and they were in the ballpark. And because they are so knowledgeable of our operations, we felt that they are an appropriate firm to use. When it comes to the wastewater COP, if and when we get there, it's a little more of a complex transaction because it will involve new money, as I said, but it also could potentially involve refinancing of existing debt that they have. So because of that additional complexity, the fee for that one would be $97,500. And as with the financial advisory services, the fees, they're all payable from bond proceeds if they are actually sold. So lastly, I just want to just close with the key steps in the bond sale. So right now we're in the middle of drafting the documents, and Orrick Harrington is doing a lot of their due diligence work to make sure that the information we provided them makes sense and is reasonable and all that. The next step really will be in the next month or two, we'll be going out to Moody's and S&P to get a bond rating. And this essentially is a credit score. So whether you're taking a mortgage out, as I said, as an example, it determines effectively what kind of interest rates that we are going to be able to offer or required to be offered. The higher the rating, the lower interest rate potentially we would be able to pay. So that's going to cost us probably somewhere around $2,500. This is a piece that won't be paid through the bond proceeds. We'll have to pay it out of pocket, but it's a fairly nominal amount for us to get that rating or those ratings. The next step, leading up to May, Council will have to adopt resolutions that allow us to move forward with the actual sale of COPs. And then at that point, we'll actually go to the marketplace, and our financial advisor will assist us in this, or actually coordinate this process. We will basically put out an RFP, and a lot of the investment bankers will bid on that. And again, all done online. They usually have 24 hours to submit their bid. It's usually all done in the last couple hours, sort of like eBay. The last people bid at the very last moment. And then our financial advisor will help us to calculate what is the best bid. and it's not really intuitive because you can't just look at the nominal interest rates. A lot of it has to do with how they structured their proposal, the combination of term bonds, serial bonds, and the like. But they will assist us in determining what is the lowest, what's called total interest cost, or TIC, and that then will be, that investment banker then would be awarded that bid or that contract. And then we will, as I said, close sometime in May with an entire COP issue. So things will be moving pretty quickly as we in the next several months. And really, that's it. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. What's our competition when we go to the marketplace?
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilmember Hotchkiss, our competition are other municipal bond issuers, so anybody else that's in the market. So that'll be our competition, but we don't expect that to be too much of an issue. I mean, we're going to get a pretty good price because of the interest rate environment today. The investment banker, whoever bids lowest, will buy all of the bonds, and then they'll be in charge of actually marketing and selling those bonds to individual investors, whether they be individuals or institutional investors. But yeah, theoretically, our competition is other municipal bond issuers.
Other municipalities,
yep,
primarily. And at what point do we say, okay, do we want to do this? I mean, if we don't get the price we want?
I think at this point, unless the market conditions change where we see interest rates really start to climb quickly, I think we're going to, my guess is that there'd be no reason for us to move forward with the other ones, the wastewater, and particularly the waterfront, which is going to be sort of last in line. Interest rates could move against us, and the savings could not make it, may not make it worth it for us. But I'm hopeful.
Not enough of a difference in what we've got now.
But if there's some money there, it's worth doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Mr. White.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Mr. Smarino have discussed a little bit the length of term on these COPs. Can you describe what you're anticipating at this point?
Sure. So, and we talked about this at the Finance Committee. We typically, or generally speaking, when we refinance existing debt, we refinance it over the remaining term of those original bonds. So, for example, if we had a 30-year bonds and we were 15 years into it, and we were refinancing those, we wouldn't extend that for another 30 years. We would refinance it and be sure we're paying off those bonds within the remaining 15 years. And there are a lot of good reasons for doing so. One is always good to just pay off your debt as soon as you can. It's always also important that whenever you're issuing bonds, that you establish the term to align with the useful life of those related improvements or assets you're acquiring or constructing or improving. You wouldn't want to be paying debt on something that no longer is really in place or in service or is beyond its useful life. And I know the question had come up whether or not, why not look to extend it even farther anyway, because there could be some potential savings. And that's true. On a budgetary basis, for example, I said we could realize about $135,000 a year in budgetary savings per year, right? If we said we're going to spread this over another 30 years, we could be paying $75,000 a year, so, or save more than $135,000. But in an economic sense, in terms of total dollars you will pay over the term, you will end up paying more. And so from an economic perspective, it's not a wise business decision to extend it beyond that. You try to keep it to the shortest term as possible because interest rates become a factor.
So a couple of things on that. One is that I certainly appreciate the point that you don't want to be borrowing money against something that's going to be end its useful life. You don't want the loan to be extending beyond that, and that certainly makes good sense. And is that the case with the for example? Well, let me finish with where I think this might be useful to go. If there is more life in a facility that we're financing, my take is anyway on both water and wastewater that we're likely to be borrowing some more money over the next 20 years. That's sad but true. We're just not running on cash flow well enough to be able to do otherwise. And if we're having to borrow at a higher rate in 5 years, 8 years for some improvement, wouldn't it be better to have, or let's just say reaching out 16, 17 years beyond that 15-year time period, wouldn't it be better to have borrowed money longer term at a low rate? Since the competition, let's face it, in 15 years, I think everybody expects rates to be higher than they are today. So I'm kind of more looking at borrowing opportunities going out past that 15-year window and wanting to maximize the city's opportunities there. So perhaps I can just leave it with that be discussed with our advisors and at least the best strategy ascertained from that, because I think that it's a more nuanced problem than just we want to pay things off. Thank you. I guess that was the question that turned into a comment, Mr. Chair. Excuse me on that, Mr. Chair, Mr. Mayor.
Just don't call me Shirley. Okay, very good. If there are no further questions of Mr. Samario, I'd entertain a motion. This is an action item.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Very good. On to the next thing.
Item number 14, multi-year rate and revenue study and revisions to water rates.
Okay, Ms. Bjork.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, members of council. I'm Rebecca Bjork, the Water Resources Manager, and I have with me here today Sudhir Partawala, who's with Raftelis Financial Consultants Incorporated. We're here today to present to you the results of a rate study that we have conducted for the Water Fund to look at a couple of different items. We're looking at the Water Financial Plan, which is the multi-year revenues that we project we need in order to meet the operating, debt, and capital improvement needs of the Water Fund. We're also looking at how water rates are calculated, and we want to talk a little bit about how those rates are calculated and what the design objectives behind the rate calculation is, and then summarize proposed changes. We also have looked again at water and wastewater connection fees, which is the fee that new customers pay when they become customers of the water or wastewater system. And in essence, it's a fee that allows those new customers to reimburse existing customers for the investment that the existing customers have made on their behalf to provide adequate capacity and maintain the facilities so they'll be available when new customers need them. And then we'll talk briefly about wastewater and our proposed approach for the next fiscal year for wastewater rates, and then we would be requesting a council action. I want to start with the Water Financial Plan. Water rates are important to us as they are the revenue that allows us to do the work that we need to do to support the water system, which is not only providing water, but much more of the rates go to maintaining the infrastructure and treating the water that is delivered to our customers. So the primary role that water rates provide is to provide the revenues necessary to operate the system. Because we have some flexibility in how we design rates, there are some other components that we think about when we develop water rates. I'm sorry, I jumped way ahead. We're talking about the revenue plan. So we're looking at the assumptions for that. And the first assumption is the 3% per year of inflation. And then the second assumption that we've made in looking at the revenue plan in terms of what our needs are is the city's general plan growth figures. We've also looked at our anticipated capital program needs to meet critical system needs. And that's a little bit harder to estimate in terms of looking exactly what will happen, but we've given our best estimate. We're looking at conservation totals. We expect a reduction in the sale of water to meet our conservation objectives, which is helpful in controlling overall costs in the future, but it presents somewhat of a challenge in generating the revenues necessary to meet our system obligations. And then we projected a reserve interest rate of return of 1.8% per year. So using those general guidance, this is the rate adjustments that Raftelis has developed projecting forward to 2022 in terms of what we are looking at for additional revenues for the water fund. You can see that in 2014, we're looking at a 3% revenue increase. I do want to point out, as we will discuss, and as I jumped in to start to discuss earlier, we're making substantial changes to the way that we change the assessment of those rates. So people won't see a 3% across the board rate increase. It will vary based on customer. But we are looking for a 3% revenue increase. For 2015, we also, again, will be looking for 3% additional revenue. Then 2016 through 2019, looking at 3.5%. I do want to say that for the last revenue plan, we were looking at annual increases of 3.5%. And then for 2020 through 2022, 4%. I am showing this graph not to talk about the capital program, but just because the capital program is really important to our rate needs, our revenue needs. And what I wanted to focus on is down at the bottom where we have the total funded projects, and we can see that next year we're looking at funding $11 million in capital, and then typically we're more in the $5 to $7 million per year range, which is just keeping up with more of our annual program of work on pumps, reservoirs, and pipelines. And then again, in fiscal year 22, we see a fairly large program where we anticipate doing work on one of our reservoirs. We use this graph to show how our reserves are in regard to council policy on reserves. And you can see that in 2013, we have substantial policy reserves above policy. That is a planned action. We have been waiting and saving that money so that we would have the money available to fund the recycled water filter plant. And so we will draw that down substantially next year and again in the following year to fund that project as well as additional projects in the water fund. After that, we managed to stay right about council policy through 2021. In 2022, you can see a substantial dip into council policy. At this point in time, we don't believe that it's necessary to make changes to this financial plan that's sufficiently far in the future that it's really beyond our ability to plan that precisely. We would expect to come back to council with an updated financial plan probably in 5 years. So that's the water financial plan. I'm happy to answer questions about that component at this point, or I will take them at the end as council wishes.
Any questions? I had one question myself. So as we look at the graduated rates of percentage increase, is that anticipating greater conservation as we go? Is that factored in for usage differences?
That's correct. It is.
Because it's always an interesting conundrum of the conservation objectives versus the revenues and how we balance that out. I mean, at some point, if you don't sell enough product, you're not going to have the revenues, obviously. So,
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, I think that's an excellent point, and I would like to address it briefly because I think it's important for our customers to understand. Water system provision has really moved away from selling product to being more of a service. And so, although we do have a product per unit charge, what most of the rates go to isn't actually supplying that water. It's providing the service to provide that water. It's the pipes, the infrastructure, the investment in our reservoirs and the treatment plants for that water, less than actually paying for the wet water itself. And so it is a challenge as we try and encourage conservation to get the message about, well, I'm using less, but my rates are going up. I think the point I'd like to make on that is that conservation is very cost effective in that it keeps us from having to invest even more in the service by developing additional resources for provision of water by developing additional supplies. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Not to shock a lot of people, but looking at those figures compounded, that's close to 50% in the course of until 2022, correct?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I didn't actually calculate it. I do want to point out that rates are the only source of revenues for the water fund. And so just as we expect our tax base to grow or our other sources of revenue to grow to keep up with inflation, this is our only means of keeping up with inflation. And we've tried to keep the rate growth close to what we would expect inflation to be over the next period of time. So yes, it is an increase, but basically it's more or less an increase to keep us where we are.
I understand. And if that inflation is less than 3%, we adjust downwards, although it rarely is. But
that's correct. We can change. We adopt rates each year, and each year we come to council and make a presentation on what our actual financial health is at that point. And so each year council can make a change to rates. This is just an opportunity to try and provide some long-term planning for the water fund so that we can start to plan and project what projects we think we can accomplish. And a big part of that is understanding what revenues we think we're projecting.
I understand. Thank you.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. and we're sort of dividing our questions and comments into this versus the actual rates, which we're going to hear more about momentarily. But one of my questions, which I primed Ms. Bjork on ahead of time, was this rate system here does not contemplate replacing pipes at a 1% per year rate. It comes in at, I believe it's 0.9% per year. And I know that there's a reason for that, but I would appreciate Ms. Bjork going over that a little bit, and also I want to make a couple of comments afterwards on that.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, Councilmember White, that's correct. If you look at our water capital program and what we have projected funding, we do have a couple of years here where we are not fully funding our projected needs. We have assigned that unfunded portion of the capital program to the water main replacement project, primarily because that's the easiest project to scale. So each year we can decide how many feet of pipe we need to replace. There are a couple of things going on. In looking at our revenue source, we want to be fairly conservative in looking at revenues so that we don't expect more revenue than we get and end up not being able to pay our bills. At the same time, in looking at our expenditures, we also try and be as realistic as possible. So in the event that we see revenues come in above projections, which we generally try and at least make our revenue projections, and expenditures come in below, we will have a surplus, and we do see that. What we do in that circumstance is program that money into the capital to make up for the shortfall. The reason to program the shortfall in the pipes project is that because of the scalability of it. It's hard if you're rehabilitating a pump station to scale that project. It's going to be the size it is. So that gives us a lot of flexibility to respond to the changes in our actual revenues and without putting false pressure upwards on rates. And it's something that we are, it's sort of an adaptive management approach that we have adopted in terms of managing our budgets, but something that I think we probably should more formally adopt so that it can be more understood. And
to translate that, at least into perhaps more hometown language, we customarily have a little money left over from our budgeting, and that money would be the money that would go into accomplishing the 1% per year replacement schedule. That there's customarily a little bit left over from all these massive projects. And that's the money that would fill in that 0.1% gap that we're not funding. And I just when I thought about this, the chances of us hitting a target get really a lot lower when we don't aim at it. And that's partly what we're doing here by going at a point for 0.9% instead of a 1% replacement program on the pipes. I really want, and that's replacing a pipe every 100 years. That's not opulent investment in our infrastructure. It's basic standards, but that's all. And I don't want to lose that. I just want us to stay attentive to that idea. And if we do fall behind, if we don't have the extra money to do that 1% per year, I really want future councils to know about that a lot earlier than 10 years from now. I think if an adjustment, there will be many adjustments between now and 10 years, and one of them needs to be allocating funds to hit that 1% per year pipe program. And I appreciate that there's flexibility in here, but I really want us to keep an eye on that ball. And so as we talk about this further, I'll be asking for at least feedback from staff as the years go by to make sure we're hitting that target. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Okay, Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ms. Bjork, you mentioned that the main cost driver here is the treatment and distribution of the water rather than the cost of the raw water itself. When a customer is looking at a bill, could you give us an idea of roughly what the percentages are?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, Customer Francisco, if we could defer that until we get into the discussion of the actual rate component, I think I'd be better able to address that.
Fine.
I did want to just point out with regard to the infrastructure, we did take a look at our track record, as it were, since we started doing this 1% per year goal, and we have complied with Council's objective over the long term, and that we're at 3.19 miles per year on average, where our goal is 3.07. But I want to also call your attention to the fact that the last decade is not where we've made those gains, in large part because in the last decade we have funded $60 million of improvements to the water system to comply with one EPA rule, and that has really caused a difficulty in balancing keeping rates at the level they need to be and meeting obligations for infrastructure. So I did want you to see where we are with regard to the goal. I think that's important. So thank you for the lead into the water rate calculation, Councilmember Francisco. As I started to say earlier in my excitement, we have designed the rate to try and provide the basic, sort of what we consider lifeline needs for residential household at a low affordable block, which is actually less than if you took the overall average cost of water, less than the average. But in doing so, we've also designed the rate to support local agriculture, which has been a council actions in the past, to continue to incentivize water conservation. And I want to say that we spent quite a lot of effort on looking at this particular component of the water rate structure, because as I mentioned, being able to avoid additional supplies is our best way to contain overall costs. We wanted to structure the use of irrigation water so that there was an adequate supply of irrigation for people who have just an irrigation account and for facilities such as parks and schools, to encourage them to use water wisely, and that's with a water-wise landscape. It's not structured to supply all the water you'd need if you wanted a yard full of grass. And we'll talk a little more about how that is structured. Commercial rates are a little different. One of the things that really allows us to avoid having to develop new supplies is our customers' responsiveness. We have a fantastic customer base in Santa Barbara. They are very responsive to water conservation issues, and when we ask for conservation, they really conserve, as was evidenced when we had to take Cater offline a few weeks ago, and we got a 20% reduction in water use. That gives us great flexibility in managing our supplies. Commercial customers, their demand is much more driven by the business they do. They have much less ability to really turn down their water use, and as such, our provision of water to them is more expensive. And then, of course, we wanted to make sure that we would could comply with Proposition 218, which sets the rules about about setting rates. And so with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mr. Pardawala to talk about how we actually came up with the proposed rate changes.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, members of the council. Again, my name is Sudhir Pardawala with Raftalis Financial Consultants, and I'm the project manager for the rate study that we conducted for the city. Before I start, if I can just address the one question that Councilmember Hotchkiss had regarding revenue adjustments. I can tell you that from our experience working with other agencies, we are seeing significantly higher revenue adjustments required for a variety of reasons, one of them being the fact conservation and the increasing cost of supplies, as well as because of capital improvements and so forth. Increases of 7 to 10% are not uncommon at all, and some much, much higher than that. So in our opinion, the city is doing really well with the small revenue adjustments that they are planning over the next several years. And to get back to the presentation now, after having looked at the revenue adjustments, come up with the revenue adjustments, and define the rate objectives that we are looking at, the city's objectives in structuring rates, the next step in the process is actually going through a cost allocation process that is consistent with industry standards set by the American Water Works Association, and we follow those standards to comply with Prop 218. So the first element that we have come up here that shows us the meter charges by meter size. These meter charges are composed of two components. One is a fixed component called customer service, which is the same for all meter sizes, and the other one is the capacity component that varies by meter size. And it takes into account some peaking factors, peaking considerations of the meters, the hydraulic capacity of the meters in designing the charges that accrue to each meter size. So as we can see here, we have the smallest meter size is going to have a small increase. Some of the other meters after that 3/4 inch to 1 to 2 inch meters will actually see some decreases, and then we will be seeing increases for the larger meter size. Now the reason for this is because going through this analysis that we went through and identifying the cost structure, the fixed component and the one that varies with the capacity of the meters, this is how it works out. So basically this allows us to set rates that are consistent with the cost of servicing those meters. The next element of the study then, after we have set the meter charges, is to identify where we are going to be setting the tiers and what are the rates for those tiers. So one of the first things that we do when we start this rate study is to analyze the usage. Over the last several years, you might have noticed that there has been a trend towards reduction in usage, and that is consistent all over the state. In fact, all over the country, there has been a significant reduction in usage for a variety of different reasons. The indoor usage definitely has gone down with the higher efficiency appliances, low flow fixtures, and the emphasis on conservation, and definitely the outdoor irrigation needs have also come down. So having reviewed the usage, what we are proposing is that first tier, which provides the basic health and safety needs, we will retain that at 4 units per month for single family and multifamily both. For the next year, because of the fact that we are beginning to conserve more water, we are asking that we reduce that allocation in the second tier for single family residences from 16 units to 14 units, a reduction of 2 units. And for multifamily, they really don't have any irrigation needs, so we are reducing that from 8 units right now to 4 units. That's the allocation in the second tier coming down. So the second tier actually goes up to 4 plus 16, 4 plus 14, 18, and multifamily goes from 4 plus 4 to 8 units monthly usage. And then the third tier, we want to make sure that we are sending that signal for conservation. And so we are looking at, right now, there's just a very small increment between the second and the third tier. So we want to have a higher increment there for that third tier to make sure that we send that signal for conservation. And as you can see in the rates, there's a small increase in that first tier, and that represents a cost of ongoing costs. The second tier, there is a small reduction, and that is partly generated from the fact that we are reducing that second tier down, and so that results in a small reduction in that second tier. And the third tier, we are sending that signal for conservation, and that you can see increasing by $1.09 from the current $5.53 to $6.62. Looking at the rates for the residential, multifamily, and commercial customers, we identified what the rates were for single-family customers. The rates for multifamily customers follow the same rates. Basically, the allocations are different for multifamily customers, same first 4 units in the first tier, an additional 4 units in the second tier, and anything above that is charged at the third tier rate, which is, again, the rate that signals conservation. For commercial customers, again, for the reasons that Ms. Burke indicated earlier, because of the drought response and the costs associated with that, we have the first tier set at $5.16, which mimics the second tier rate for residential customers, and the second tier rate is equal to the same as the third tier rate for residential customers. The question regarding impacts on single-family customers, I think that council member had that question. As you can see, we have identified those impacts at various levels of usage. For very low customers that use up 4 units of water, they would see an increase of 78 cents per month, less than $1. For a customer that is using 8 units a month, that increases of 42 cents per month. And then for a moderate customer using 12 units a month, which is more of an average kind of usage for the city's residential customers, single-family customers, the increase is relatively small, just 6 cents per month. And as you get into the higher usage, you can see that there will be a significant difference compared to the current rate. At 32 units a month, you'll be looking at $15 plus, and at 64 units, about $50 per month. This chart kind of gives you an idea as to how single-family residential usage varies in the city. For the very low customers, about 21% of your bills, the annual bills, it doesn't mean that the same customers are going to be in that class, but 21% of the total bills that are generated in the city on an annual basis use less than 4 units a month. Between 4 and 8 units, you have 27% of your customers, and then the moderate usage between 8 and 12 units, you have another 19%. So when you look at that, the usage in those 3 different tiers, that represents more than 75% or close to 75% of the total usage in the city, about 70% of the usage in the city, from very low to the moderate usage. And the remaining 31% are the ones that use relatively higher amounts of water. And this chart here shows you again how our rates, the city's rates, compare with some of our neighbors. The first one there is Goleta Water District. City's current rates are the second bar, and the proposed rates are the third bar. Montecito is the fourth one, and Carpinteria is the last one there. As you can see, we are significantly lower than the next lowest one, almost $10 lower on a monthly basis. For a 5/8-inch meter using 12 units of consumption per month. These are based on 12 units of consumption per month, which is typical of the city's average usage. So one of the areas that we looked at very closely is how we go about setting up irrigation rate changes as well as irrigation allegations. And this particular slide here kind of talks about what we are doing with respect to irrigation customers. So one of the decisions that was made is to make sure that we provide the irrigation customers an adequate allocation based upon the actual weather conditions. And so we have redefined what amount of allocation we will provide irrigation customers based on their acreage and based on their actual weather conditions, and I will go into that here in a second. The second was to simplify instead of having multiple classes for residential and commercial irrigation, we have decided to combine those and have a single rate for them. And then because we are redefining the allocations based on actual weather conditions, we figured we no longer need to have a carryover where a customer could use any allowance that he had not used previously. So based on these different considerations, we have redesigned the irrigation rates. And it's important to understand how we have determined the irrigation allowances for different types of customers. Basically, the California Irrigation Management Information System, called CIMIS, in the state has weather stations all over the state, and there are actually a couple in Santa Barbara. What we are looking at here is station number 107, which looks at all the weather conditions. So it looks at the temperature, rainfall, humidity, and so forth, and determines what is the level of usage that is needed for cool season grass, and that is represented by ET0, which is called evapotranspiration for cool season grass. That gives you the maximum usage, so to speak, for irrigation purposes. And then everything else is defined as a percentage of that particular ET0. So for example, when you're looking at shrubs, they don't use as much water as that green grass, the cool season grass would use, so you have a certain percentage of that being used for different types of plants. So we have used the identified ET0 data, which is the weather data, and the acreage, and associated the total plant factors as well as an irrigation efficiency to define what is the total allocation for different types of customers, for residential, for parks, and for agriculture, agriculture being avocado grows. So we've come using those three different classes of customers. We have identified what the total allocation for these different classes of customers would be. Now, if you focus your attention on the last two columns there, the last column actually gives you the current allocation for irrigation, residential and commercial customers, recreation parks, and for ag customers. So as you can see in the second last column, going through the method that we just defined, you will see that there is a significant increase in the total allocation that will be provided to these different classes of customers.
We have a question. Mr. White?
Thank you, Mayor. I don't see what those are. Those units. What's the unit of measurement there?
The units are 100 cubic feet per acre.
HCF.
That's
so those are
right.
HCFs.
Right. So for a residential commercial.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Sorry about that.
Right.
Per acre. All right.
Per
Thank
acre,
you.
right. For a residential commercial, these are again only irrigation accounts. So customers that have irrigation meters specifically, as opposed to a meter that serves both irrigation as well as domestic uses. So for an agricultural customer, for example, that has 1,080 units, 100 cubic feet being 1 unit per acre, they would now have 1,519 units per acre. And again, this will change as the weather changes. So if the weather gets hot, they would actually get a higher allocation for that month, and then it will change as the weather changes. So this provides an ample incentive for having efficient usage for these irrigation customers. And the rates for these irrigation accounts are identified here. Basically, irrigation at least for residential commercial, they are not considered essential, and so they are tied to the second tier and the third tier rates. Usage that falls within the allocation comes in the tier 1, and usage in excess of the allocation that we have provided will fall in tier 2, which is being inefficient is charged at the highest rate. For parks and schools, because they are a public use, they are provided a little lower. The water allocation, the different sources of water that are allocated to these different classes of customers, they get a little allocation of a lower cost water source, and therefore their rates are a little lower than they are for the irrigation for residential commercial. And then for ag, because of the objective of providing the ag customer relief, we have assigned the lowest cost water source to them, and therefore they have the lowest rates in this class. Again, if they exceed their efficient level of usage, then they will be hit with the highest cost, which is the $6.62, a significant increase from where they are right now. Recycled water, we have retained the current policy of the city at charging them at 70%, 80% of the irrigation rate for parks and schools. And then the outside city customers, city currently has a surcharge of 30% over the inside city rates, and we have retained that. We actually went through a pretty detailed analysis to identify what this allocation should be for, the surcharge should be for outside city customers. Currently, there are about 11% of the ratepayers are outside the city, and they have significantly more facilities than what are required for inside city customers, in addition to what the inside city customers need. And as a result, we identified what those facilities are and how much it costs to actually maintain and serve those facilities, to provide service for those facilities, and have determined that the increment surcharge is slightly higher than the 130%, but we have asked to retain the same. Our recommendation is to retain the 30% surcharge.
Question for Mr. Hotchkiss.
We got a rather sharp letter here from somebody who's one of the people that gets the 130% charge. Could you explain that a little bit about why it costs us 130% to serve people outside the city, even though they might be right across the street from somebody who's getting a 100% charge?
So we are treating, first of all, when we look at classes of customers, we look at a whole class. So we have identified the outside city customers as one class of customers that they're outside. And so we look at all of when we are trying to identify what that surcharge should be, or if there should be a surcharge, we look at what are the different facilities that are required to serve those customers. So we have additional pumping stations, for example. We have additional lines that go out to these customers and so forth. So when we have identified and the maintenance costs associated with those lines, in addition to the ones that are in part of the city. So the water that flows to these customers has to also use this inside city facilities as well as those outside city facilities. And so when we look at the incremental cost of serving those outside city facilities, as I said, we went through a pretty detailed analysis of identifying what assets are required to serve those and the cost associated with serving those assets, and have come up with that surcharge.
So, I mean, if I live on one side of Mission Canyon as opposed to the other, I'm still going to say, well, why did I get put in this class? Why am I not just put in my area?
Well, as I said, we are not identifying it by on a per customer basis. It will happen very often that you could be on one side of the street and yes, you do get charged the higher charge because you're not within the city. You are in fact getting lumped in with all the other customers that are outside the city, and so we are not looking at it on a customer by customer basis.
Well, I guess you'd have to say this is one of the perks of living in Santa Barbara.
It is common in all. So when we're looking at all the classes of customers, you see, we lumped all the single-family customers into one class. So we're not identifying each customer and saying because he's close to the treatment plant, and so he should not be paying for all the rest of the mains and so forth that are associated with the treatment plant and so forth.
I see.
So they're all within the city. They pay an average rate. These customers are all outside the city and they pay the same average rate. We cannot go customer by customer.
Thank you.
So to follow up on that, you said 11% of all ratepayers are outside of the city. Is that just residential ratepayers, or is that ag and commercial?
That would be all customers, I would believe. Any customer that's outside the city limits.
So it'd be commercial and ag as well?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, yes, that's correct. Anyone outside the city, but it's almost exclusively single-family residents outside the city. There are only a few.
I was just thinking about some of those avocado belts up in the foothills. I didn't know if that was...
There are a few agricultural who would also have an irrigation meter, usually an ag irrigation meter, so they would have the 30% surcharge on that irrigation meter. That's correct.
Thank you.
The only exception that we made to this outside city surcharge is for the Earl Warren Showgrounds, which are basically a kind of a donut hole in the city, and so they are not using any facilities. It's just a unique customer that is within the city, and we have decided not to have them included as an outside city customer. They would pay this inside city rates. Another element of the study was to review the fire line charges. These are charges that are charged to customers that have private fire service. And going through the cost allocation process, we identify what the total cost is for fire service. There are significant components of the water system that are designed to handle fire service, like the distribution lines, the storage, and so forth. So we identify those costs associated with that, allocated between public and private fire service based upon the total capacities that are involved, and then determine what those charges are for private fire service. What you see here is that there would be a small increase in a 1-inch line, fire service line. Some of the other ones would actually see decreases. The 1.5-inch and 2-inch would see some decreases, and then you would see some increases for the larger meter sizes. We currently don't really have a 12-inch line in the city, but as part of this study, we've just provided that in case you do have one. For the larger ones, you do see that there is a significant increase from where we are currently. And that just falls out from the capacity or the demand that they would impose on the fire system. Okay, so that basically concludes the water rates part of the presentation. What I want to talk about next, I don't know if you want to address any questions at this point or...
Any questions from council? Ms. Murillo?
Thank you. So I'm sorry, you're going to go on to wastewater, so this is ask water now?
I would first want to talk about connection fees and then get into wastewater. Go ahead, okay.
I'll ask my questions now if I may, because...
Sure.
Okay. So I'm looking at the 218 notice that's in our packet. And in the middle of the page there, proposed changes include, can you just go over again, reduction in allocation of amount of water in single-family residential Tier 2 from 16 HCF to 14. Can you just go through that again, why those are being adjusted? And thank you.
Yeah, again, as I indicated, Madam Council Member, we looked at, when we do these rate studies, we look at the usage pattern within the city, and when we are looking at these usage patterns, we have determined we have to identify at what points we want to have breaks. And recognizing that there has been over the last several years, there has been a significant reduction in usage from single-family residences. We have decided to tighten that tier up so that we can send that signal for conservation. So most of your users are actually falling, as we saw in that one chart, are falling below that 16 units. 80% of your 70% of your bills are within the. Actually, it's more than that. It's about 80% of your bills fall within the first 18 units. Actually, 83% of your bills fall within those first 16 units. Only 17% of the bills would exceed that the 18 units a month. And that's part of the reason why you want to provide enough of an incentive for those users that are using more water to conserve water. So it's a matter of judgment as well as looking at what would best meet the needs of the city. That's pretty typical to use in that range, somewhere between the 15 and 20% range, to come up with that the number of bills that would be impacted by that third tier.
I think what happened was I understood it when I read it in the narrative, and then when I saw it translated into the numbers, it kind of. Ms. Jordan, did you have a clarification?
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem and Councilmember Murillo. I just wanted to add that we did look at the average use of our single-family residential and multifamily, and we ran a lot of calculations based on, as was mentioned, that there's so many changes in the plumbing fixtures from 15, 20 years ago. With high-efficiency fixtures now, as well as landscaping. As you know, we've had an extensive conservation program over the last 20 years, and we have our Smart Landscape Rebate program, and we've really worked with our customers, and they've really stepped up. And so we're grateful because so many of our customers, as you can see now, have a very wise water use at their homes. And therefore, what we're doing is setting the price signal to say, be a part of this, be a part of our programs, have a water-wise landscape, have high-efficiency fixtures, and if you do, you will most likely stay within Tier 2. And that's the price signal that we're sending.
Can I just ask you, because you're here, and I think it's a point that I always like to let people know that turf lawns really soak up water, don't they? And if people have a concern about global climate disruption, if they want to save money on their water bill, if they want to do the right thing, they would consider landscaping in what you're calling water-wise, correct?
Absolutely. As was mentioned with looking at, we get very scientific about it with our CIMAS weather stations, but kind of just as a layperson term, what Mr. Parbwala was mentioning is that the turf grass uses, the ET is about 100%. And then if you're going down from there, the shrubs are actually only using 30%. So it's almost a 70, it's a 60 to 70% savings, basically in kind of round numbers of water if you're taking out the lawn and going to water-wise shrubs.
Good. I just wanted to get that out there since people are watching TV, I hope. And who are our irrigation customers? That's kind of funny. I see schools and parks, but.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilmember Murillo, we have a number of different irrigation customers. We do have schools and parks, but we also have, for instance, commercial facilities who all of commercial water is billed for water and sewer. So if they have a substantial use outside of their commercial facility, they might have an irrigation meter which does not get a sewer bill. Similarly, multifamily residentials may have a separate irrigation because the individual units are using the water inside, and they're able to differentiate the outside use, and they would have an irrigation meter. And we have a whole breakout of it, but in broad terms, those are sort of our groups of irrigation users.
Thank you. And I, too, was struck by the Family REIT's letter about 30%. They pay more for their water. But I guess I was thinking of it, and I don't know, maybe are they here for public comment? I'm not sure. But I was thinking, it looks like someone wants to talk about it. that you have to draw the line somewhere. I mean, that's what I was thinking, you know, and yeah, sometimes it's like the school districts. You're on the other side and you have to go to a different school of the street. So but I was struck by some of the things that Mr. the Reitz family, that was written in there. It did seem to make sense. And I know it's just a painful reality, you know, for some people. And then along those lines, so this thing about the state customers is, that's specifically for the Earl Warren Showgrounds?
That's right.
So this is some accommodation that we're doing for our neighbor there.
Councilmember Murillo, they are a class of one, as it turns out, but they are a class of one that's unique in that some of the reasons for the increased costs, as was discussed, is that as a class, a substantial portion of a disproportionate portion of our infrastructure supports out of city. But as a class, with regard to the Earl Warren Showgrounds, there is no difference in what it takes to support them versus somebody in the city, including that even the streets that serve them are city streets. So we have additional costs for when we work in the county because there are additional steps, but even the streets we have to work in around Earl Warren are our own.
I appreciate that, and I hope that it softens Earl Warren Showgrounds a little bit to the impacts that they have to our residents in that area. There's noise concerns. They have a lot of special events. I'm not so bothered by the ugly banners. Some people are, but I think if they don't adhere to our noise ordinance, I have concerns about that. And since I'm opening my mouth about it, I guess I'll make a call to their leadership and see if I can talk to them about these issues. I get concerns from people in the San Marcan and people along Las Positas about the activities at Earl Warren Showgrounds. And I say that with every intention of being a good neighbor to them. And I hope we can establish some communication there. The big increases, sir, that were down at the bottom, right, so it's going to go from 40.91 to 261. Who are those people?
We don't have a 12-inch customer right now, that's right. That was put in there, but we do have 1 or 2 10-inch meters right now.
Okay. That's the end of my questions for now. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chair, you might, excuse me, Mayor, the comments and questions I have, I see we do have at least one public comment person, and
if we could
this
reserve comments
could
until we get
continue
to
on,
the presentation, that'd be. So if you would continue, please.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, the next element of the study was to compute connection fees, and what we're talking about here is the cost of having a new customer connect into the system to provide capacity to that customer as opposed to the physical cost of actually connecting into the system. Because existing infrastructure has been laid down, which has been supported by rates and charges from existing customers, a new customer, when he comes into the system, needs to compensate that existing customer. In our case, we are looking at basically existing infrastructure supporting new development, new growth, new connections as they come into the system. And the common method that is used is called a bind method. And what we have here is the replacement cost less depreciation represented by the RCLD. That's what that stands for, replacement cost less depreciation of the total assets that are used to serve the city's current customers. So when we look at these assets, we go ahead and identify each asset, the year in which it was constructed, the original cost, depreciated it, and then look at an inflation factor to bring it up to the replacement value. Because the asset is used, we do take into consideration the depreciation element as well. The new customer will also be buying. The second line shows the reserves that the water enterprise currently has. The new customer will be becoming an owner, part owner of those reserves. So we've added that in there. And we've subtracted the amount of outstanding debt which will be covered when the new user joins the system. He will be paying that through his rate. So we have subtracted that. So that then gives us the total asset value. We look at what does their assets serve right now, and we are actually serving about 10.75 million gallons per day, and that gives us a unit cost of $213 million divided by the 10, then gives us a unit cost of $19.90 per GPD. Then we use what would be the average usage for a single-family residence. 305 gallons per day, and that 19.9 times the 305 then gives us our the proposed connection fee for a single-family residence, which works out to $6,070 compared to the current $5,691, an increase of about $380 for a new connection. We go through the same kind of analysis on the wastewater side as well, where we look at all the assets, compute the replacement cost, less depreciation, add the reserves, subtract out the existing debt principal, come up with a net asset value, and divide that by the total wastewater that is produced in the system to come up again with the dollars per GPD of wastewater. Again, taking the maximum wastewater that is generated by a single-family residence, we use that to come up with the proposed connection fee of $49.77, which is about $859 higher than the current fee of $4,118. The next step, we have identified the charges for a single-family residence, which is basically served typically by a 5/8-inch meter. And on the wastewater side, we've equated that also for a 5/8-inch meter. Then anything in excess, larger meters would, on the water side, definitely impose a larger demand on the system, and so we use the hydraulic capacity of that meter to come up with the charges that would be charged to the larger meter sizes. And we use the same methodology on the wastewater side as well, which is consistent with what the city is using right now. And that basically concludes the connection fees for water and wastewater.
Moving to wastewater rates, we did ask Raftellus to do an evaluation of wastewater rates. They've done a preliminary evaluation. The results of that suggest that we would like to do additional study. There are some changes in there that we need to better understand in terms of what the drivers are. Additionally, we believe that we would need to do additional public outreach. The timing for Prop 218 notices is such that we don't have time to do the public outreach we'd like to do. Nor do we feel that we have the sufficient background and information at this point to recommend to council substantial changes to the wastewater rates. So what we are recommending is that we notice a 4% rate increase, which is consistent with our existing financial plan, that we continue to do the rate evaluation, do the necessary public outreach, and address this issue for fiscal year 15 rates. So a 4% increase would take our maximum, and I want to point out this is our maximum single-family wastewater customer, from 39 to 21 to 40.78 per month, which is very similar to most of our neighboring utilities. So with that concludes our presentation. I do want to say that today we are asking for a number of actions from council. We're asking for for approval to notice the rates consistent with the rate study. We're asking for adoption of the revenue plan for water and noticing of the wastewater rates. We are not, and I want to be very clear, we're not asking for adoption of the rates at this point in time. We've discussed the connection fees, but we are not asking for those to be adopted either, as we would have those presented as part of the fee resolution the council typically adopts as part of the budget each June.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I have one public speaker to comment on this item, Mr. Peter Marin.
Yes, I live in Mission Canyon, so I'm here to represent all Mission Canyon residents. And of course, we didn't know anything about this till I saw it in the paper this morning. And that's one of the difficulties. We are not in the city. We don't have representatives. We're not represented by county representatives. So in point of fact, when you raise the rates, we are just at everybody's, whatever you want to do to us, you can. I remember in my area, when we connected up to the city sewer, which actually ran right across our lane, right? It was 6 feet from my house. It was 6 feet from everybody else's house. It was on our property. The city charged people $8,000 just to hook into the sewer that was already running under their property. That didn't count the cost of hooking up. That was just to get permission to hook up. But of course, you had no choice because you had to hook up because nobody could have septic tanks. So this goes on and on and on. The problem with this rate increase, as far as I can understand it, is simply this. Part of the rate increase is because of the cost of water and facilities. However, when you get to the upper tiers, that's a punitive rate. It's punishing people because they use too much water. It's not connected to the cost of the water, and it's not connected to the cost of facilities. A bit of water in that fourth tier doesn't actually cost any more to produce or to process than water in the first tier. You're just charging more because you don't want people to use it. The problem is that we are being charged 130% for that water as well as all the rest of the water. So you're punishing city residents, charging them a certain amount because you want them to limit the use of water. Fair enough. But you're charging us 130% of that, which seems quite unfair. My suggestion would simply to be, if we're talking about equity here, is that when you get to the upper tiers, you cut out our 30% surcharge and you just charge us the same punitive rate as you do others. 30% at the lower rates would cover the cost of processing the water. But you can't keep doing that. If you see a 50% rise by 2022, our rise is going to be 65%. And that's just not fair. Secondly, not everybody has a water-saving yard. You want our yards to be watered. The reason you want them to be watered is because, as we all know, fire is going to come right down through there into the city. It threatens to do that every time there's a city in the hills. You don't want our yards dry. You don't want those trees dry. You want everything gardened nicely and kept in shape. People are willing to do that, but not at 130% of ordinary rates. That's simple, and it's only a question of fairness. All we can do is appeal to you because we have no power in this matter.
Thank you. Okay, so, to the council. Mr. White.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse. So I have a couple, we've heard bits, I think, that Ms. Murillo and then Mr. Marin's comments allude to some of my concerns, and that is the squeeze. The biggest squeeze that I see coming out of this rate system is obviously the drop in the size of Tier 2. That puts pressure on single-family residences, notably, perhaps to a lesser degree multifamily, but the single-family, the mid-sized single-family residents will feel that, and even harder, the squeeze is on the summer months. When you start, we keep hearing about average, but that's, and we've accommodated irrigation and we've accommodated ag with a flexibility, but we're not accommodating any flexibility with the change of demand on a single-family residence in the hot months. There's no carryover. There's no change of allocation. It's if you use 14 units in December, you'll get the you can water your lawn and all that kind of thing. But that same lawn or that same shrub field, if it's just a larger one, in July, August, September, is going to need. And perhaps staff could tell us what would be the expected evapotranspiration rate change from average from winter to summer. So that's one. I think it's an area of real concern, and I'd ask staff to give us some comments on that.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilmember White. When we looked at the calculation for the taking Tier 2 down, we looked at the average square footage landscaped in the city, which on average is 4,000 square feet for landscape, which is significant because when you look around on typical average lots, it's smaller than that. But there are some properties that are very, very high in square footage of landscaping, and so they bring up the average. So we felt that 4,000 square feet of landscaping was actually fairly generous. When we look at the indoor water usage, we're on average on single-family residence, 3 people per home. That's the average. And so the Tier 1, the 4 HCF, is given that, on normal, very high efficient usage, that should about cover the indoor usage, maybe a little bit more. But for simple, basic indoor usage at a very high efficiency use, 4 HCF will cover that indoor usage. So we have then the additional 8 HCF in the Tier 2 for the landscaping. Now, granted, this is, again, on average, because, as Mr. Podwala mentioned, we're doing one class of customers. And so we're looking at general averages, but we felt like, again, on average, that would cover most of a water-wise average landscape usage in the summer.
In the summer?
Yes.
Okay, so I that was not clear to me in your presentation. So that's intended to.
And that, again, that's average, but customers do have the option of getting an irrigation meter. Customers that want that have large properties that want to supplement in the Tier 2 rate could get an irrigation meter.
Okay, that's another option. Okay, well that will be the place where most people will feel the folks that feel the ouch will be that change of in Tier 2 from it's going from 8 units to
18 units to 14.
18 to 14, 16 to 14.
The allocation is 16 to 14, right?
16 to 14. Okay.
And if I could just also mention, as far as Firewise landscaping, is that we do have the Firescape Garden at the corner of Stanwood and Mission Ridge Road, and we have excellent examples of both Firewise and Waterwise landscaping that customers that are in that area can take advantage of that type of landscaping in order to maintain having a fire-safe landscape, but also have it be water-wise.
Great. So I appreciate hearing that the assessment was made on the average use during the summer was where those numbers came from. Is that on a average sized lot, as it were?
Well, to clarify, it was an annualized amount, but it is looking at what a property would be using for 4,000 square feet over a year, because as you've mentioned, the number doesn't change. It's 12 for every month. But yes, over an annualized amount over a year.
And there's no carryover that's proposed here?
Correct.
Okay. All right, thank you. And then the other area where I'm still scratching my head a little bit is and Ms. Murillo raised this as well, is the difference between our ag rate and our irrigation rate. Our parks are paying 80% more for water than our farmers, and that's a tough one. And I know that when we start talking about our parks, we're talking about a lot more water. The farmers use there aren't very many, and they don't have a big acreage, and so it's not a big overall number. That can evaporate, so to speak, in our total use. Whereas the parks, and perhaps Ms. Bjork could give us what is the total portion of city water use that would come through the irrigation meters.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilmember White, for city parks, we have total irrigated area of 59 acre feet per year, of which 95 acre feet per year is provided by recycled water. So that means that we're providing 64 acre feet of potable water for our parks. Of course, the recycled water cost is 80% of the regular irrigation cost, so it is less expensive.
Right.
By comparison, for agricultural, we have, excuse me, I have to find it on here, 141 acre feet per year, or 57 accounts, which is just about 1% of our potable water demand.
Okay. And then, so parks is a third of that. So that's and then schools are.
Our schools.
Obviously, that's going to be a mixture. You're going to have
Yeah.
both commercial use and I don't know whether do they have an irrigation meter or?
We have only 6 school accounts. Most of the schools are irrigated with recycled water. 4 of the schools don't have a separate irrigation meter. Allison and her staff have been working closely with the schools to try and address water conservation and metering issues with them, so we'll continue to work with them on that as well.
Well, perhaps, Ms. Jordan, could you comment on how we're doing with our schools and in that regard? That's an interesting piece of this.
There are currently 4 schools that do not have separate irrigation meters that are on potable usage for their irrigation. And so we are working with the school district right now, looking at the capability of using, because we have our AMR technology meters, we are looking at the possibility of adding those onto the main city meter as a sub-meter, so to be able to remotely read the irrigation usage and then bill those sites for their irrigation usage separately.
And so they're charged at a commercial rate. Would that be what a potable school would be charged at a commercial rate?
Correct.
So then they get water at last year's allocation would then come forward as their cost,
as well as sewer. So they will have a significant savings because it would be going from the commercial potable rate to the irrigation rate, as well as no sewer charge.
Okay, very good. Well, anyway, Mayor Rouse, that area feels a little odd to me. It just as is the ag world getting such a better rate than our parks? And at least it sounds like there's a portion of school uses that are charged at the irrigation rate, and that would fall under that same area of concern that, gosh, should they be paying double what the farmers are? So I want to at least put that question out there for as we go along and struggle with this, or at least work with this issue. Thank you.
Well, I know that when we had these ag rate discussions before, it was kind of the portion of the entire system the ag rates really were and how that affected it, and of course our general desire to try to preserve agriculture as much as possible, possibly as a fire break in this production. And when you are irrigating parks and whatnot, you're irrigating lawn and grass area, and ag is a different situation. But it's a point well taken. I'm a little bit intrigued. I'm not going to attempt your last name by the gentleman's comments on the weather stations. How many stations do we derive data from for the city of Santa Barbara?
The data that we have used comes from one station, basically.
It kind of blends into the folks that are just on the outside and paying the surcharge for being outside. Is that, we're made up of a lot of microclimates, and certainly I'm going to assume that the folks we've been talking about are kind of up in the foothills, Mission Canyon area and whatnot, and Mr. Hodge just talked about, and how their transpiration or evapotranspiration would be completely different than, for example, mine down on the mesa, where we just get mold and that kind of thing. So I was curious, is using a solitary weather station as a standard by which to determine water consumption. Could you speak to that?
Mayor Pro Tem, I have looked at this because I too was wondering, and we actually currently have 2 CIMMYS weather stations in the city. There's one at the city's golf course, which is Station 107, that we're proposing to use, and there's also one at our Vic Trace Reservoir on the Mesa. And then Goleta Water District has one at their water treatment plant, which is more in the foothills. And as we did this analysis, we looked at all of the data, and it was actually surprising to us that there wasn't a significant change. There are some changes, and it tends to be in the shoulder months and the spring and the fall. But overall, as has been mentioned here, is that these are averages. And what we're doing when we calculate the allotment amount is we're giving now, as you saw, the allocation is actually increasing from what is currently being given. So we felt like, because what we're using is the percentage of the plant factor, so there's a percentage reduction of the ETO from for turf usage and for shrubs. We're also calculating using an irrigation efficiency factor, so that gives people a credit for it because irrigation systems aren't 100% accurate. So it's looking at a landscape irrigation formula that the state creates, and it does create into it some cushion, some conservative estimates. And so that's why you saw that actually, on average, the allocation will be increasing from what we currently have. And so we felt comfortable with that. And it's not exact, and yes, there are microclimates, but we felt like it wasn't significant enough to try to split the city into sections and say this one would be for this station, this one would be for that.
All right, very good. And I was going to ask also a question about the wastewater system as we go through to the goal of greater conservation of water use. But on some level, that also stresses the wastewater system, does it not, in terms of treatment, and you've got a more concentrated mixture than you would have otherwise?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, we do see what we would call higher strength wastewater in Santa Barbara, certainly than we saw historically. And Mr. Pardawala can speak about, since he's done wastewater studies elsewhere, we do have higher strength. It doesn't stress our ability to treat the water in that we are able to develop a system. As you probably know, it's a biological system down there. So we're able to develop the ecosystem to be adjusted to the waste strength that comes in. There are costs associated with a higher strength waste, but there are also costs associated with volume. So they sort of offset each other.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, what we are talking about is reducing the total flow in the system, but the amount of strength which is represented by biochemical oxygen demand and suspended solids remains about the same. See, so the concentration is increasing because the flow is going down. So the amount of strength that is going into the treatment plant in terms of pounds of strength remains about the same. When we look at the cost associated with treating flow and strength, there is more cost associated with treating flow than there is associated with treating strength. So in terms of the design of the equipment and so forth, so by actually reducing the flow, you are creating capacity in the system, so to speak. You don't have to increase the capacity if you add additional, upgrade your treatment plant to provide additional capacity. So in essence, what we are doing is when we're looking at the overall cost allocation to flow and strength, because there is a higher allocation to flow, because all of the equipment is designed, a lot of the structures and so forth are designed for flow, which are very expensive. In essence, we are, it does not impact the cost of treatment. If anything, it actually reduces the cost of treatment in that you can allow new users to come in the system without adding any additional capacity.
Thank you for that answer. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. I'm ready to move the staff recommendation. At the same time, I acknowledge the reality that we need to pay for the cost of these services. I think staff has made an argument for water and wastewater. I'm sorry for Mr. Marin and other people who live outside the city. I think that's another harsh reality that we're facing, or that they do. And I'm not sure if Councilmember White feels so strongly about the ag rates versus park rates, but I'm not so moved to lower ag rates as I am, or raise ag rates as I am. I would love to lower park rates because they're our own people. But I'm moving the recommendation as it stands.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So ordered. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Okay, we're moving on to item 15. Would clerk please read that?
Contract for design services for the temporary relocation of the 911 call center.
All right, very good. Mr. Casey and Mr. Hagmark.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Rouse and council members. Good afternoon. We're here to talk again about the 911 call center. We'd like to restart the design for the project and move forward with construction. As you recall, this was going to be paid for by the redevelopment agency, and we are in the middle of design work to move it out of the police building basement and into the Granada garage when we had to put all projects in the redevelopment agency on hold. We have a financial plan that I'll talk about at the end of our presentation about how we would recommend paying for it, but we think this is a top priority for the city and we need to get this project done, and so we would like to restart it, and that's what we're here today to get your approval for. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joshua Hagmark, a principal engineer in Public Works, to talk just briefly about the project and the scope and where it's going, and then I'll follow up with some of the financial details.
Mr. Hagmark.
Mayor Pro Tem, council members, we can go a long ways back. We've been talking about the police station for quite a while. But I'm going to start in 2011 when staff finished a comprehensive building assessment. And we identified in that building assessment some major deficiencies with the building and some major issues to deal with. I'm just going to name a few of those. Seismic structural performance was an issue, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, the electrical, the plumbing, ADA compliance, lead and asbestos, fire protection, parking, and contaminated soils were amongst the top issues when we went through the complete building assessment. As a result of the magnitude of all the issues and deficiencies, we came back to council, and a council subcommittee was created in March of 2011 to help us work through these issues and to help make some recommendations to council. In June 2011, based on recommendations from the council subcommittee, staff was directed to move forward with the relocation of the 911 call center. The decision to move forward was based on two major points. Concerns by the council about the safety of the call center in a major seismic event. And the second one is the council subcommittee was also recommending rebuilding the police station on site, which meant that at some point we were going to have to move the 911 call center anyway. And so the construction of the future police station was going to take about 2 years. And so if we have to move it at some point, why not move it now, get it into a safer, better location? In October 2011, council approved a contract for design services to move forward with the temporary relocation of the call center. Staff quickly got to work on it, but in December of 2011, the RDA funding was pulled and the project was brought to a halt. At that point, we had completed a needs assessment on the 911, so we knew basically what kind of square footage and what kind of items were going to need to be moved at that point. So that brings us to today. The recommendation before you today is to restart the design. The current design approach includes renovating approximately 2,600 square feet of the second floor of the garage office space, which currently has the environmental services group and a large conference room. The proposed layout would include a 1,400 square foot 911 call center, which the needs assessment identified as a minimum size for the call center. And a 1,200 square feet, the other 1,200 square feet would be used for environmental services. They'd be moved back in after construction. The conference room would not be replaced. That's what would not be put back in. During the needs assessment, the second floor was determined to be the preferred location due to security issues, trying to figure out a good location in that building, and we could provide adequate security if it was on the second floor. The design effort is anticipated to take about 6 months, and at which time we'd go out to bid and come back to council with a recommendation for construction sometime as early as November, but I'm thinking probably closer to January of 2014. From there, construction, I'm anticipating we'd be able to move and have an operational 911 call center in about July of 2014. So that concludes my brief overview, and if there's not any questions, I'll turn it over to Mr. Casey.
Any questions from the council? Mr. Francisco.
I spoke briefly with Mr. Armstrong about this, and it's not clear to me why we couldn't have the dispatch center in the fire department. Fire Station 1 is seismically retrofitted. If we could put the dispatch center there, we wouldn't have to move it. We wouldn't be talking about a temporary installation. It would be a permanent one. So what's the rationale for not doing that?
And I see Chief McElroy here. Maybe you can add in that for us.
Yeah, Council Member Pro Temp and Dale Francisco. Of course, it's a possibility. And in 2008, when we did the renovation of the fire station, we came to council And at the time, we didn't know the structural deficiencies of the building, but we were looking for a new home for our EOC because when we went through the T-fire, we did not have enough space to really adequately operate that facility. And so that was a high priority at that time. The EOC takes up about 1,700 square feet, and it has, I say it's the EOC, that's one of its main uses. It's also the main training facility for the fire. And so it's heavily used, but that's a 1,700 square foot facility right now. If you were to put the 911 call center, it would basically eat up that entire space. And you'd be looking for a new home for the EOC and then fire training. And I don't know if Fire Chief wants to speak to that.
Chief?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse and fellow council members. I think it's important to note that the current location of the EOC was part of the original construction of the fire station 50 years ago. And since that time, over the last 50 years, that space has functioned as our primary training classroom for the department. Not only our department, but other agencies use it. The training for the OES division of the city uses it frequently, which is used for computer training for other departments in the city. And that use never went away when the EOC moved into that space. So right now it's utilized, it's already being doubly utilized. So it functions as our primary training classroom as well as the EOC. I think adding in the combined communication center in that space gives us a whole new set of problems. In the event of a major disaster, that space becomes unusable. It will also, I think, in a major disaster, interfere with the functions of the activities going on at the main fire station, the mutual aid responsibilities. They'll be using that building. So I can see, while it appears to be an attractive alternative, I think that there's some problems with it. Just even having to do with not only with the space of the square footage of the building, but parking, the supervision of parking for supervisors as well as dispatchers occupying that space at the same time you're running the main fire station.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about funding. Mr. Armstrong, was there some possibility of there's sort of leftover money from RDA, or once we file is it called the property management plan, then there might be some funding?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, I had part of the presentation. I want to talk about funding now. If you want me to go to that, I can. If there are any other questions, good. Let me just keep going. Total project cost is about $2.5 million. What we're asking for today is the design portion, about $277,000. And our approach to funding this project kind of stems from the dissolution of the redevelopment agency. If you recall, part of what we've had to do is turn over a lot of the cash we have on hand to the county, essentially, and then they redistribute that money to the different taxing entities. And so we, as one of those taxing entities, gets back to the general fund about $2.2 million of one-time money. Comes back to the general fund, unencumbered, falls to our bottom line, essentially to reserves. And so our recommendation today is that you take $277,000 of that one-time money that's coming back to us and let us get going with the design work and kind of queue it up and be ready for construction. Then when construction rolls around, we'll have a better cost estimate, and we'll have a real cost estimate because we'll have a bid in hand. And then we'll have two options going forward to pay for the construction amount. Our preferred option and our hopeful option is that as part of this redevelopment dissolution process, if we play by the rules and pay up all our money, we receive a safe harbor status, and that allows us, in theory, in the legislation, to use the bond proceeds that we had not finished using. And so we have about $10 or $11 million of bond proceeds still to be used. We think this should qualify as a project to be able to use bond proceeds to pay for this 911 call center. And so that would be our first recommendation, is that when the construction comes around, we go to the Oversight Board and the State Department of Finance and we submit this project to be eligible to be used for bond proceeds. And we think that we've got a good argument to make, and we're hopeful. But we never want to count our chickens on this whole dissolution process. And so our backup plan, and why we feel comfortable going forward today, is use the remaining of that $2.2 million of one-time money that we have back. If we've already used about $277,000, we have a little less than $2 million. And we have about a $200,000 gap, and we think we should dip into our reserves and general fund reserves and finish this project off. Again, we think this is a high enough priority that it warrants that kind of approach. And so those are the two approaches we have to financing the construction part. And let's let the dissolution process play itself a little bit out, but get the design going so that we're queued up and ready to go when the time comes.
Yeah, thank you for that. Having served on that committee, on the police station committee, I can attest to the urgency for getting that 9/11 center moved. It's totally inadequate right now. And like Mr. Francisco, I had asked the same questions of the administration and the chief about that moving, so I'm appreciating the testimony for the public, because I know a few folks asked about that in the DO meeting this morning, because it did seem to make sense on its face, but we need to do the most expeditious thing we can do to get that thing moved. I believe Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let me make sure I understand this. We want to use the 277 required here from the money given back from the, state, I guess, at this point. And then we're hoping that when the Oversight Committee would give us the remaining funds to cover this whole thing. However, if they did not, take it from there.
If they did not, then we would use the remaining of the $2.2 million that we originally have. But we've spent $277,000. So we would use the remaining of that, and then we'd have to come up with about an extra $200,000 of general fund reserve, for lack of a better term.
Okay, and Mr. Armstrong, do we have a problem with that?
No, and I think we feel, I guess, probably 80 to 90% confident that, at least I do, that eventually we'll get to use those that bond money for capital.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse. First of all, I appreciate Mr. Francisco raising the question again. And it is, I think, if we were to go back in retrospect and look at the whole EOS effort of, when did that start? 6 years ago, something like that. That if this had been conceived at that point, there might have been an opportunity to build that space at that time and fit it into that tight site. But obviously, that's just hindsight. I expect that each council member has approached staff over the last couple of years with, as this police building issues arisen after RDA is doing its number, that this item is so important. And I appreciate that staff is bringing this back at this time to get this moving. It's out of sync a little bit with sort of total budget stuff, but it's so important that we need to move this forward soon. And I think that the question of of it moving to the fire department or to fire the fire station was an important one to answer as we move forward. And the other area, and I would ask for some comments from staff when this comes forward for construction purposes, is why not blend or merge with the county fire? I mean, the other question we're going to have to answer when we get to that time of spending the big bucks is why is it not a good idea to propose to merge with the county fire? And I'm at this point anyway, I'm satisfied that this is a good way to go, but I do think we should answer that question, which I'm hearing from constituents as well. As I say, just from the comment perspective, I'm really grateful that you're bringing this forward as soon as possible. And thank you for that.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One more question for Mr. Hagmark. When this, let's assume that this goes forward, and when this is constructed, and we have all this communications equipment and infrastructure in the Granada garage, when that happy day arises that we actually have a new police station, is it envisioned that that equipment would be transferred to the new building, or would it be reused for some other purpose in the existing location?
Yeah, Councilmember Francisco, it is envisioned that the equipment would be moved back into the building. I think you might recall during our last discussion, part of it was a grant every 4 years, we're eligible for about a $500,000 grant through the 911. It's a tax that's collected on people's phone bills. And so they're constantly trying to keep that information, because the 911 call center is something that's in operation 24/7. And so that equipment gets a lot of wear and tear. And so keeping it, refreshing it, new stuff. And so depending on the pace in which we're moving along to replace the police station, we could be seeing new servers and stuff coming along with that. But of course, if there's anything we can use in this thing, we will look to move that back into the new police station.
Thank you. All right, very well. Well, this is an action item.
I would move the staff recommendation, Mr. Mayor Rouse.
So moved and seconded. All those in favor, signify by aye. All those opposed? Very good. So ordered. Thank you. Move on to, what do we got here? Council member committee assignment reports. Oh, let's see. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, sir. Well, a number of us attended a West Beach gathering with the Entrada people on Entrada project. It was well received. I would say there are concerns still about what we're going to do with State Street. Do we make it more, as it were, pedestrian friendly and kind of a continuation of Upper State Street, where we have tables and chairs serving on the sidewalks, or do we keep it more like it is now? That'll continue to be something of a debate, I think. There was a first Thursday night art display here in the mayor's office and mine, and featuring Herbert Byers, the artist who created the Chromatic Gate, both here in Santa Fe, which is hopefully going to be completed in a month or two. Well, weather dependent. And finally, this morning, Mayor Pro Tem and I attended the groundbreaking for Sansom Clinic, which looks to be a terrific project and should be in place in 18 months.
Thank you. Mr. White.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse. I attended the Water Commission meeting yesterday and heard that, of course, the drought that we see outside is in fact projected to continue. Rainfall is projected to be below average from here forward, so we can kind of look forward to that. And probably the most I'm glad to see Ms. Bjork in the room still here. She can back me up on this. One of the items on yesterday's agenda was the Regional Water Quality Control Board issuing a number of fines to the city on the sewage treatment plant. It sounds like basically an unfair set of rules from my perspective, where there's samples that are there were 3 categories of tests that were made that were contaminated sample tube resulted in 8 violations at $3,000 a violation and such like. The sewage treatment plant is running well, but these testings appear to have triggered these infractions. There are some 31,000 samples that have been taken over the last 3 years, and a very small number of them showed such things as these contaminations, and resulting in 31 infractions. And I think it's sounds like an unfortunate set of rules. There should be a way for that for those heads up to occur without having to issue a fine. Thank you.
Ms. Murillo.
On a lighter note, I attended the Menudo Festival this weekend, and I'd like to congratulate Officer Adrian Gutierrez for organizing it. And it was a fundraiser for the Police Explorers, a program that gets young people, local young people, into the police force, which I support. And I'd like to thank the businesses who were sponsors and the restaurants who brought food. And I tasted every offering very good. I don't need menudo for maybe a couple of months now. But it was delicious. The Latino community came out. I'd like to thank Tere Urado and the people who provided music, and there was dancing. It was just a really fun time, and it raised money for our young people. And it was a good, positive connection of the police department and our community. So congratulations.
Okay, and then yesterday I was a guest with the Pescatore Club, which is a bunch of the older mover and shakers in town, and their overriding concern were the developments along State Street and the eventual narrowing of State Street to one lane each way. So I'm sure we're going to be hearing a little bit more about that in the near future. Very good. So we have a number of closed items. If the clerk would please read those.
Item number 16, conference with real property negotiators regarding acquisition of properties for the Mason and Coda Streets Bridge replacements. Item number 17, conference with labor negotiator. Item number 18, conference with legal counsel pending litigation. Item number 19, conference with legal counsel pending litigation. And item number 20, conference with legal counsel potential litigation.
Okay, very good. We will have nothing to report out from that. And I'd like to adjourn in Fred Benko's memory. Fred was a skipper of the Condor and a big advocate for whales and general channel health, and a big mover and shaker when it came to helping craft some of the regulations that I think have increased our whale populations in terms of tanker traffic and so forth. So we'll do that in Fred's honor, and we'll adjourn.